Joe Rogan had built a reputation for being the kind of interviewer who didn't let people slip through the cracks of easy answers. He often framed his conversations in a way that forced his guests to defend their own records, beliefs, and credibility. When Jasmine Crockett sat across from him in the studio, the anticipation was heavy. Listeners expected her to be challenged in ways that politicians usually weren't. Rogan started almost casually, his tone calm but his questions sharp, almost surgical. He leaned forward and asked about her credentials, not the broad title of Congresswoman that everyone already knew, but the foundation behind it. He wanted to know if she was as accomplished as her supporters claimed, or if her reputation was just political branding dressed up for the public. Asterisk. The way he phrased it caught Crockett off guard for only a second. A lot of people out there, Rogan said, hear titles and talking points. They don't always mean much. What exactly makes you credible? What have you actually done that proves you deserve this seat? The question hung in the air, and there was a subtle challenge hidden in his tone. He wasn't asking politely. He was probing, testing her ability to defend herself without a script. His audience had seen this dynamic before. Guests stumbled, tried to spin answers, and ended up looking smaller under the glare of his unfiltered questioning. Asterisk. Crockett didn't flinch. She leaned back, exhaled slowly, and let the moment breathe. But before she answered, Rogan added another layer, pushing her further. There's this perception, he continued, that politicians hide behind rhetoric, that they throw out buzzwords but don't have the track record to back them up. So I'll ask again, what makes you different? This time, his words had an edge, a pressure designed to expose weakness. People listening live could feel the tension grow, waiting to see if she would stammer through a polished line that wouldn't satisfy anyone. Asterisk. Instead of diving into defensive mode, Crockett began speaking with measured clarity. She acknowledged the skepticism that Rogan represented. She knew many people listening probably shared his doubts about her. But then she shifted the tone by recounting her career before entering politics. She didn't just cite positions she had held. She spoke about the cases she had fought in courtrooms, the communities she had defended as a lawyer, and the grassroots advocacy that had put her in front of real people with real problems. She made sure every word connected to something tangible, not abstract. Asterisk. Rogan listened, nodding occasionally, but his body language still suggested disbelief. He interrupted her once, pressing harder. But lots of people say that, Jasmine. They all have stories. How do we know this isn't just another polished narrative? His question sharpened the moment further, almost daring her to prove him wrong. This was his signature move, cutting through the surface, trying to catch a guest leaning on platitudes. Asterisk. Crockett was ready for it. She reached to her side and pulled out a folder, a move that surprised him. She laid it on the table between them and, with a calmness that contrasted the intensity of the moment, began flipping through pages. She explained that she had anticipated this very question and wasn't willing to let the conversation be swallowed by assumptions. She pointed to records cases she had handled, documentation of policies she had worked on, and community projects she had overseen long before she stepped onto a national platform. Asterisk. Rogan glanced at the pages she presented. The skeptical look on his face didn't vanish immediately, but it softened in increments as he processed what she was showing him. He tried to ask follow-up questions, but Crockett had answers that were rooted in verifiable detail. For the first time in the exchange, it wasn't Rogan steering the conversation, it was her. Asterisk. The shocking part for the audience wasn't just her composure, it was the way she flipped the dynamic. Rogan was supposed to be the one cornering her, but by asking directly about her credentials, he had opened the door for her to display a level of preparation that few expected. His question, designed to expose weakness, ended up becoming the perfect stage for her to demonstrate strength. People listening could sense the shift. The balance of power at the table was no longer leaning toward the host. Asterisk. By the time Rogan leaned back again, his posture less tense than when he began, it was clear that his question about her credentials hadn't landed the way he expected. Instead of unraveling, Jasmine Crockett had anchored herself with facts, and it forced him to look at her differently. The audience knew they had just witnessed something rare, a moment where Joe Rogan's pointed skepticism didn't strip someone down, but instead set them up to rise higher than anyone thought they would. When Jasmine Crockett reached into her folder and placed the documents on the table, the atmosphere inside Joe Rogan's studio shifted almost instantly. It was the kind of move few guests had ever tried, and even fewer had executed with confidence. Rogan, who was accustomed to people stumbling or scrambling when he pushed them about credibility, now found himself staring at physical evidence stacked neatly in front of him. The camera caught his brow furrowing as he leaned forward, hands resting on the edge of the table, eyes scanning the papers she slid across. The moment was quiet but heavy, a silence that carried more weight than words. Asterisk. Crockett began explaining each piece, not with the rehearsed tone of a politician, but with the precision of someone who had lived every detail. She pointed to court cases where she had represented individuals in vulnerable situations and explained how those outcomes shaped her views on justice reform. She highlighted policy drafts with her name attached, showing the early work that eventually became proposals debated on the floor. Then came the community program reports, charts, budgets, outreach numbers, all hard evidence of where resources had gone and how lives had been affected. Asterisk. Rogan followed her words carefully, flipping through the documents himself. He wasn't quick to admit surprise, but his expression betrayed him. He had expected generalities, maybe a rehearsed speech filled with lofty claims. Instead, he was staring at receipts that connected directly to the very challenges he had raised. He tried to interject, asking questions like, "How do we know these numbers aren't But Crockett was ready for that too. She cited sources, referred him to public databases, and pointed out independent audits that verified the work. Each answer closed the door on doubt a little more. Asterisk, the listeners who tuned in could sense Rogan adjusting. His pauses became longer, his interruptions fewer. He was still probing, but the usual sharpness in his tone was softening. For once, he wasn't dominating the conversation, he was absorbing it. Crockett had managed to do something unexpected. She changed the rhythm of his show. Instead of defending herself against accusations, she was teaching him about her record. With him listening in silence, asterisk, the most shocking moment came when she showed him a stack of letters from community leaders and grassroots organizers who had worked alongside her. These weren't vague testimonials, they were detailed accounts of projects completed, programs launched, and outcomes measured. Rogan picked up one letter, read a section quietly, then set it back down without comment. The cameras caught that hesitation, and it spoke volumes. This was a man who prided himself on questioning authority, yet here he was, momentarily stopped by the weight of evidence. Asterisk, Crockett didn't push too hard. She wasn't smug or condescending. Instead, she let the documents speak for themselves. Her calm tone and deliberate pace created a contrast with the growing silence from Rogan's side of the table. The audience watching the live feed flooded the chat with comments pointing out how unusual it was to see him in that position. Clips later spread online with captions like, "Joe didn't see this coming," and Rogan finally speechless. Asterisk for Crockett. The documents weren't just proof, they were armor. They shielded her from the skepticism he had thrown at her at the start of the conversation. Every piece of evidence she laid out made it harder for Rogan to frame her as another politician with empty words. In fact, the shock for the viewers wasn't only in what she showed, but in how thoroughly she dismantled the common perception of politicians. Being unprepared for tough questions, asterisk, Rogan, still processing, finally admitted, "I wasn't expecting this level of detail." It wasn't a full concession, but it was more acknowledgement than he usually gave. He leaned back, rubbed his chin, and let her continue without interruption. The tables had turned, and the audience knew it. His platform, which often amplified doubt, was now amplifying the strength of Crockett's receipts. Asterisk, the shocking reversal wasn't loud or theatrical. It came through the quiet authority of evidence laid bare in front of someone who rarely gave ground. Rogan's stunned reaction was subtle, but undeniable, and for many, it was proof that in a world full of rhetoric, hard evidence still had the power to silence even the most relentless skeptic. Joe Rogan had built his brand on putting people in the hot seat, making even the most confident guests stumble with his relentless style of questioning. Listeners often tuned in not just for the conversation, but for the tension, the moment when someone on the other side of the table got caught off guard and had to scramble to defend themselves. It was almost a ritual of his show, and over time, it became an expectation. But during his exchange with Jasmine Crockett, something unfolded that not even his most loyal fans anticipated. Asterisk, by the time she had laid out her evidence and explained her track record, the energy in the room had shifted dramatically. Rogan, who was normally the one steering the pace, found himself pausing longer than usual before responding. He shuffled the papers she provided, tapped the table lightly as if to stall for time, and stared at her across the microphone with a look that wasn't skeptical anymore. It was unsettled. He was silent, and silence was something he rarely allowed to linger. Asterisk, listeners could sense the weight of the pause. Rogan had asked her directly about her credentials, pushing for answers that were supposed to expose cracks in her narrative. Instead, she had filled the space with undeniable facts, cases, documents, and programs tied directly to her name. She wasn't just talking about what she believed she had done. She was proving it line by line, number by number. And Rogan, for once, had nothing to cut into. Asterisk, he tried to pivot, asking about the broader system and whether individual actions really mattered in the face of massive institutional challenges. But even that shift didn't dislodge her. Crockett reminded him, with calm precision, that institutional change often began with local wins and personal accountability. Then she went further, tying her accomplishments to measurable results in communities that had previously been overlooked. Each answer landed with more weight than the last. Asterisk. The cameras captured Rogan leaning back in his chair, one hand over his mouth. It was a posture his viewers weren't used to seeing. Normally, his gestures carried a thorny pointed fingers, animated movements, and sudden interjections. But in this moment, he looked more like someone processing than leading. Clips later circulated online with captions like, "When Rogan finally had no comeback, and Crockett flipped the script." For many, it was shocking to see him in that state, because it felt like watching an unstoppable force meet an immovable wall. Asterisk. Crockett didn't raise her voice or attempt to dominate the conversation. That was what made the reversal even more striking. She stayed steady, her tone almost conversational. while laying out facts so concrete that they created a wall Rogan couldn't break through. Every time he looked like he might interrupt, she presented another piece of verifiable evidence, leaving him with fewer openings. The strength of her preparation forced him into silence, in a way no aggressive retort could have. Asterisk. Listeners who were used to Rogan's usual rhythm began commenting in real time about how unusual it was. He's never this quiet, one wrote in the live chat. Another said, I've never seen him pause like that. She's got him. The audience wasn't just witnessing a strong defense. They were watching a moment of vulnerability from someone known for his control. That vulnerability turned into the most viral part of the exchange. Asterisk. The silence carried its own kind of shock. Rogan didn't openly admit defeat, but the look on his face said more than words could. When he finally did respond, it was with a subdued tone, acknowledging that her level of preparation had caught him off guard. Most people don't come here with this much backup, he said, almost reluctantly. That comment alone signaled a rare concession from him, a recognition that Crockett had outmaneuvered him on his own stage. Asterisk. The viewers who clipped that moment didn't focus on her words as much as they did on his expression. The slight widening of his eyes, the hesitation in his breathing, the way he leaned back as if to physically distance himself from the weight of her evidence. It wasn't the typical fireworks people expected from a Rogan interview, but it was shocking in its own way. He, the relentless interrogator, was momentarily speechless. Asterisk. For Crockett, that silence was victory enough. For Rogan's audience, it was something they hadn't seen before. A guest not only holding her ground but flipping the dynamic entirely. And for Rogan himself, it was a reminder that sometimes the blunt force of skepticism isn't enough when the receipts are this airtight. The clip that spread across platforms in the days after Joe Rogan's sit-down with Jasmine Crockett wasn't just about what she said. It was about the moment when even he, the man who thrived on pressing his guests into corners, had to pause and take in what she laid in front of him. His show was built on pushing conversations to their limits, testing whether someone's words could hold under the weight of scrutiny. But in this instance, it wasn't the clash that stood out, it was the way undeniable proof shifted the balance of the entire exchange. Asterisk. Crockett hadn't come to the table armed with clever rhetoric or rehearsed lines that could be dismissed as political spin. She brought receipts, and not the kind that could be brushed off with skepticism. The records she laid out documented cases she had fought in courtrooms, policies she had worked on from the drafting stage, and grassroots programs that had clear, measurable outcomes. She presented audits, financial records, and letters from independent organizations that backed up every word she spoke. Each piece fit into a larger picture, a politician whose claims weren't abstract but grounded in verifiable action. Asterisk. Rogan, who was used to challenging authority figures and exposing empty promises, found himself facing a wall he couldn't scale. The moment was shocking, not because he argued loudly and lost, but because he didn't argue at all. The silence that followed her presentation carried more weight than any heated debate could have. For someone whose strength was often in questioning and dismantling, he had no follow-up that could pierce the solidity of what she laid before him. Asterisk. Viewers recognized instantly how rare this was. Clips of Rogan staring at the documents, lips pressed together as he considered what he was reading, went viral across multiple platforms. This is the first time I've seen him actually sit back and just listen, one viewer commented. Another said, she didn't out-talk him, she out-evidenced him. The language around the moment reflected how unusual it was to see someone flip the dynamic of his own show against him, not through argument, but through irrefutable receipts. Asterisk. Crockett herself didn't bask in the silence. She didn't try to exploit it with grandstanding or smugness. She let the evidence speak, continuing her explanations with the same steady voice she had maintained throughout. That choice only magnified the shock of the exchange. If she had tried to hammer the silence into a victory lap, the moment might have lost its weight. Instead, by simply continuing with calm certainty, she turned the silence into proof of her credibility. Rogan's pause became the punctuation mark to her evidence. Asterisk. For Rogan, the experience was visibly unsettling. He leaned back in his chair more than once, rubbed his face as though trying to process, and finally admitted with a short nod that her level of preparation wasn't what he had expected. He didn't say much more than that, but in his show, small concessions carried heavy meaning. His platform was a place where he often left guests scrambling. Here, he was the one recalibrating. Asterisk. The viral aftermath became its own story. Commentators pointed out how rare it was for a guest to leave Rogan speechless, and some even described it as a turning point in how Crockett would be perceived by critics and supporters alike. The impact wasn't just in what she proved, it was in how she proved it. By bringing hard evidence and calmly presenting it, she set a new standard for what credibility looked like under pressure. Asterisk. People who had dismissed her before as just another politician were suddenly confronted with images of Rogan, the man whose audience trusted him to cut through quietly, while her receipts did the work. That image was more powerful than any sign. It symbolized a shift in the conversation about her, and it made clear that sometimes the strongest rebuttal isn't a verbal sparring match, but the unshakable presence of facts. Asterisk. What made the moment so shocking was not just that Joe Rogan went quiet, but that the quiet itself revealed the power dynamic had changed. His silence wasn't empty. It was filled with the realization that his usual strategies couldn't puncture the armor she had brought. It was a lesson in how evidence, when delivered with calm precision, can silence even the sharpest voice in the room. As the conversation wound down, the air in Joe Rogan's studio carried a weight that wasn't typical of his shows. Usually, episodes ended with laughter, a bit of back-and-forth banter, or Rogan doubling down on his perspective while his guests tried to keep pace. But after Jasmine Crockett had laid out her evidence, documents, and verifiable records, the ending felt different. Instead of an unresolved debate or a heated exchange, there was an unspoken acknowledgement that something rare had just taken place. Asterisk for Rogan. The experience seemed to leave him with more questions than answers, not questions about Crockett, but questions about the assumptions he carried into the conversation. His style had always been about testing authenticity, peeling back the layers of a person until the truth, or lack thereof, revealed itself. Yet here was a guest who not only held her ground but exceeded expectations by presenting proof so undeniable that his usual skepticism lost its edge. The shock wasn't in conflict but in concession. However subtle, his expression, the long pauses, and the quiet nods became the markers of a moment his audience would replay and analyze for weeks. Asterisk for Crockett. The ending was just as important as the confrontation itself. She didn't walk away trying to capitalize on the fact that Rogan had been speechless. She didn't spike the ball or frame herself as victorious. Instead, she maintained the same steady composure that had carried her through the entire exchange. She reiterated her commitment to the communities she represented, reminded listeners that politics should be about measurable change rather than empty slogans, and left the conversation with a tone that was more about accountability than celebration. That choice cemented her credibility even further, because it showed she wasn't there to win. A debate she was there to prove who she was and what she had done. Asterisk for the audience. The ending carried a lesson that resonated beyond the walls of the studio. In an era where skepticism runs high, where words often mean less than actions, and where public figures are constantly under scrutiny, Crockett had shown that preparation and receipts could cut through the noise. The shock of the moment wasn't just that Joe Rogan was silent, it was that silence revealed the undeniable force of truth presented plainly and confidently. Viewers walked away not just talking about Rogan's reaction, but about the value of evidence in a world flooded with rhetoric. Asterisk as the episode closed. It was clear that neither Rogan nor Crockett needed to declare a winner. The power of the exchange rested in what it revealed, that even the toughest skeptic could be disarmed when faced with facts that couldn't be twisted or ignored. It was a rare moment in media, one that reminded everyone listening that authenticity is more than just a performance, it's the ability to stand in the face of doubt and let the truth speak louder than